Good evening, and welcome to another long, slow drift through the forgotten corridors of history. Tonight, we're going to descend into one of the most quietly bizarre moments in the story of the Catholic Church, a tale not of pious sermons or noble crusades, but of something far stranger. Settle in. It was a city trembling under layers of factional violence, aristocratic rivalries, and the ghostly influence of the Holy Roman Empire. Papal elections were not serene affairs of divine inspiration. They were cutthroat, literally, at times. Breathe slowly. The world of medieval Rome awaits you. But the new Pope Stephen VI had a very different opinion about whether the former pontiff deserved peace. A pope, gripped by political fear and rage, once dragged the rotting corpse of his predecessor from its tomb and placed it on trial. Yes, really. Let's dim the lights. Bishops and nobles gathered, not for a coronation, not for a council, but for a trial. The marble lid scraped open. Formosus' body, now decomposed and stiff, was pulled from the earth. He was dressed in full papal vestments, rotting form placed upon a throne in the Lateran Basilica. His skeletal hands were propped up with wires. His papal tiara was carefully adjusted, and so he sat an accused man, though long past the point of defense. The Synodus Horrendatha Cadaver Synod, its purpose, to place Pope Formosus, who had been dead for nearly a year, on trial. A hollow, ceremonial act because there was no real intent to acquit. In the late 9th century, Rome was not the serene heart of Christendom that modern travelers might imagine. And so it was that Pope Stephen VI, who rose to power in the year 896, found himself at the center of an unstable and paranoid world. All acts performed by Formosus during his papacy were retroactively invalidated. His corpse was stripped of its papal garments. The 3 fingers on his right hand used to perform blessings were cut off. His body was dragged through the streets of Rome and finally tossed into the Tiber River. Ordinations he had performed, including bishops and clergy, were declared null. Chaos rippled through the ecclesiastical ranks. But to understand why Stephen would soon do the unthinkable, we need to first examine the man he hated, the man whose corpse he would exhume and prosecute. Whispers passed through taverns, monasteries, and market stalls. Was this justice or madness? Some spoke of omens, others of divine wrath. These were all retrospective accusations, tied to Formosus' earlier political decisions in his controversial climb to power. Why had Stephen gone so far? And what would the wrath of the dead bring in its wake? That man was Pope Formosus, and it was no metaphor. The dead truly sat among the living, being judged. The courtroom was described by later chroniclers as filled with a sickly silence, broken only by the droning of Stephen VI as he shouted at the cadaver, accusing, condemning, and cursing the dead pope. He had previously been excommunicated, reinstated, accused of conspiring against a fellow pope, and had crowned not one but 2 different men as Holy Roman Emperors, bitter rivals to the other. Others say he was merely a puppet of the Spartan Zeus to humiliate their enemies, even beyond the grave. And still others suggest Stephen simply lost control of his grip on reality. His shifting allegiances and bold choices made enemies in every corner of Rome. Formosus had been a controversial pope. He served from 891 until his death in 896, and had navigated the papacy through a tangle of alliances and betrayals. When Formosus died, seemingly of natural causes, his funeral passed quietly. He was buried in the traditional manner. The world moved on. Stephen VI came to power as a supporter of the Spoleto faction, a powerful noble family that had grown to resent Formosus' political choices. In particular, Formosus had opposed Duke Guy IV of Spoleto, and instead supported Arnulf of Carinthia for the imperial crown. This made Formosus, even in death, a political liability, and Stephen, perhaps wishing to please his patron Zor, to assert his own authority, hatched a plan, a deeply, darkly strange plan. One morning in January 897, the Vatican stirred with an uneasy energy. Monks were dispatched to his tomb. To make the farce complete, A deacon was assigned to speak on behalf of the corpse. The charges against Formosus were numerous, yet vague among them: transgressing canon law, perjury, and illegally ascending to the papacy. Witnesses were called. Evidence was read. Why did Stephen go to such extremes? Some believe he was genuinely obsessed with punishing what he saw as heresy and ambition. Either way, the spectacle was grotesque. Eventually, unsurprisingly, the corpse was declared guilty. As for Formosus himself, punishment followed. It should have ended there, but Rome was far from finished with this grotesque chapter. The people of Rome, deeply disturbed by the cadaver synod, began to murmur. Even as the river swallowed the remains of the disgraced pope, questions lingered in the humid air of the eternal city. As the body of Pope Formosus sank into the murky, brown current of the Tiber River, one might have imagined the story had reached its conclusion. Just as if one could call it that had been served. The dead had been condemned. The old regime was symbolically cast away. And yet, in Rome, nothing ever ends that simply. There was something deeply unsettling about violating the sanctity of the dead, especially a man once considered the vicar of Christ. What Pope Stephen VI did not expect, what perhaps no one expected, was that the people of Rome, accustomed as they were to scandal, would react not with relief or indifference, but with horror. You see, by the late 9th century, the Roman populace had already seen their fair share of bloodshed and corruption, but the cadaver synod struck a different chord. Rumors began to swirl in Rome's crowded streets, fed by candlelit whispers in church naves and murmured prayers by market stalls. Some claimed that strange lights had been seen near Formosus's original tomb. Others reported visions of a pale figure in papal vestments, standing silently near the banks of the Tiber at dawn. A severe storm struck the city. The waters rose suddenly and violently, submerging streets and damaging churches. Determined to erase Formosus's influence entirely, he continued to invalidate the acts and appointments of the former pope. Entire dioceses descended into bureaucratic confusion, and for many, the actions of Stephen VI began to look not like piety but madness, thereby disrupting the clergy's ranks across Europe. And so, just months after the cadaver synod, a revolt erupted. In the wake of the flood, reports emerged that the corpse of Formosus had washed ashore, bloated and pale, tangled in reeds. In the depths of a dark Roman cell, he was strangled to death in August 897, just 7 months after he had condemned a corpse to trial. Others claimed that the corpse performed miracle stories that, while helped shift the tide of public opinion further against Stephen VI. More than superstition, these whispers reflected something deeper: a public unease that the cosmic order had been violated. And in the murky hierarchy of medieval Rome, such spiritual unease often translated into political consequence. Not long after the synod, the Tiber River flooded. Rather, the papacy entered a bizarre phase of rapid succession and reversal. In the space of just a few years, Rome would see 5 more popes, many of whom came to power only to undo the actions of their predecessors, creating a theological and legal whiplash that echoed across Christendom. This became a symbol, perhaps even a warning, whether by divine coincidence or clever rumor. The return of Formosus to the land of the living was interpreted as an act of God. A small group of monks is said to have found the body and taken it in secret, burying it quietly and reverently in a sacred place. His popularity, already fragile, now plummeted. The sanctity of the church, it seemed, had been traded for revenge, confusion, and factionals. Stephen, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the backlash. Or worse, he doubled down. But by doing so, he sowed chaos. Bishops, who had been ordained by Formosus, were now stripped of authority. Priests were told their sacraments were void. His own supporters in the Spalato family grew nervous. Backing a pope who had enraged both the church and the people was politically risky. Stephen was arrested. His enemies moved quickly. No trial, no ceremony. His reign ended the way it had begun, in fear and turmoil. But the story doesn't end with Stephen's death. Pope Romanus, who followed Stephen, tried to restore order by annulling the cadaver synods' verdicts. But then came Pope Theodore II, who reburied Formosus with full honors and declared all acts of the cadaver synod. Then came Pope Sergius III a few years later, who reversed the reversal and declared the cadaver synod valid again. It was a mess, a political game of papal ping-pong, each new pope using Formosus' corpse as a symbol of allegiance to a different faction or ideology. And all the while, the ordinary faithful peasants, monks, townspeople were left dazed and disoriented. Still, one lingering question echoed quietly across the hills and valleys of the Holy Roman Empire. The image of Pope Formosus' corpse, dressed in full papal regalia and tied upright on a throne while being judged by the living, did not fade easily from memory. Even long after Stephen VI had been strangled in a dank Roman prison, the cadaver synod cast a long, murky shadow over the papacy. But beyond the bizarre spectacle and rapid political turnover, what lingered most was a deeper question, one that troubled the minds of clergy and peasants alike. What had the papacy become? He was the vicar of Christ, the spiritual anchor of the Christian world. His voice mattered not just in Rome, but in distant villages across the Alps, in the monasteries of Gaul, and in the echoing stone cathedrals of Saxony. Let's step back for a moment. In the minds of the medieval faithful, the Pope wasn't merely a bishop, and yet, during this chaotic period often referred to by historians as the Saeculum or the Dark Age of the papacy, the office of Pope had become little more than a pawn in a violent game of Roman politics, of a time when noble families controlled the throne of St. Peter, and when a Pope's spiritual fitness mattered far less than whom he had supported in a feud, or which aristocrat had installed him, because after the cadaver synod, the lines between religious authority and personal vengeance blurred beyond recognition. The cadaver synod wasn't an isolated embarrassment. It was a symptom of something deeper, and that's what made the legacy of Pope Stephen VI so corrosive. Even within the church, many began to reflect on how fragile the institution had become. Sergius reaffirmed the cadaver synod's verdicts and struck Formosus from the church records once more. In doing so, he ensured that the papal office remained, for yet another generation, locked in vindictive cycles of revisionism. At monasteries like Monte Cassino and Cluny, monks quietly recorded the events in their chronicles with a mixture of horror and resignation. It had become a symbol of the papacy's instability, but either way, the damage had been done. No pope after Formosus could rule without being compared to him, whether as a victim or a villain. The Gregorian reforms of the 11th century brought efforts to restore papal independence from secular lords. The investiture controversy reminded rulers that spiritual authority had limits, and slowly, the office of the Pope reclaimed its moral gravity. In the Liber Pontificus, Rome's ancient book of papal bio, the episode was noted but without commentary, as if even the scribes did not know how to make sense of it. The later 10th century historian Liutprand of Cremona described the synod in biting terms, calling it a mad and shameful spectacle, and suggesting Stephen had descended into madness before his end. But even this disapproval wasn't enough to prevent echoes of the cadaver synod from that even in a world of saints and martyrs, politics doesn't wait for the afterlife. And maybe most chillingly, when the living are governed by fear, even the dead may not be safe. Even today, the cadaver synod remains one of the most macabre episodes in church history, but because it so clearly revealed what happens when power consumes principle. Fast forward just a few years, and the ghost of Formosus rose again, this time under the papacy of Sergius III. Sergius had been a bishop excommunicated by when he ascended to the papacy in 904, he reversed his predecessor's efforts to restore Formosus's reputation. Meanwhile, the body of Formosus reburied, honored, disgraced, and re-honored again had become more than just a relic. It is unclear whether Sergius believed in the justice of the cadaver synod, or merely saw it as a way to strengthen his own legitimacy. And yet, as the centuries passed, the church began to recover, but the memory of Stephen VI's grotesque tribunal never entirely disappeared. So, what did history learn from the corpse on trial? Perhaps the weight of a crown, especially a spiritual one, doesn't disappear with death. The tombs of history hold many strange echoes, but few are quite as unsettling or unforgettable as the papal throne that tried a corpse. Settle in, friend, as the candlelight flickers and the world outside your window softens into quiet. We'll begin another journey through the curious folds of forgotten history. This one begins not with whispers of divine revelation or humble beginnings, but with a child perched on the edge of the most powerful religious throne in the Western world. Tonight, we drift into the 11th century, into the tangled, nepotistic streets of Rome where noble families ruled the church like a family business. The papal states, meant to be sanctuaries of moral order, had fallen under the iron grip of a few rich and powerful families, especially the counts of two. They saw the papal seat not as a holy trust, but as a dynastic possession, something to be bestowed upon a loyal son, like a villa or a vineyard. This was a time long before the papacy became a diplomatic powerhouse. The Vatican was not yet the regal marble stronghold we imagine today. Instead, it was a network of crumbling basilicas and bitter rivalries, of street fights and whispered threats, where cardinals answered to clans more than Christ, and where a boy named Theophylactus of Tusculum would become one of the most infamous popes in all of history, Pope Benedict IX. He had been born into privilege, educated among nobles, and surrounded by the political intrigues of Rome. From the very beginning, his papacy was understood by all to be a naked act of nepotism. Another writer, Bishop Benicio of Sutri, accused him of rapes, murders, and other unspeakable acts. Others whispered that he engaged in sorcery, black magic, and pagan rituals, though these may have been exaggerated by later reformers eager to make an example of him. The story opens around the year 1032, in a Rome choked with feuds and ruled by aristocratic pride. The moral authority of the church collapsed under him. People grew disillusioned. Clergy fled to the countryside or aligned with rival factions. The church's internal order began to fracture. The Tusculani had held a firm grip on the papacy for decades. 3 popes before Benedict had hailed from their ranks. And so, in an act that stunned even the corrupt standards of the day, they appointed a child, perhaps not yet, having mastered Latin liturgy, seated on the throne of St. Peter. His papal name, Benedict IX. Benedict IX's papacy wasn't a single, unbroken reign. He would be pope 3 times, interrupted by rebellions, forced removals, and resignations. His story doesn't follow a straight line, but winds like a corrupted vine. Now, Benedict IX was no prodigy. He had not been raised in cloistered discipline or taught to parse theology beneath the shadowed arches of a monk. And as he grew into his teens and early 20s, Benedict seemed less interested in spiritual reform or church governance than in parties, violence, and indulgence. Contemporary chroniclers were not kind. St. Peter Damia, a reformer writing years later, described Benedict IX as a demon from hell in the disguise of a priest. Some claimed he held orgies in the Lateran palace. Still, there is one undeniable truth. Benedict IX brought scandal upon scandal. Rome during Benedict's reign became increasingly unstable, and yet he remained pope for over a decade on and off. You see, this is where the tale becomes even stranger. His first reign lasted from 1032 to 1044, during which he managed to incite such hatred in Rome that the people physically expelled him from the city. He fled, and an anti-pope, Sylvester III, was installed in his place. But Benedict, ever the opportunist, returned with armed forces a few months later and reclaimed his position. Chaos reigned once again, and here, in the ashes of his second papacy, Benedict IX made a decision that would scandalize the Christian world and stain his name across the centuries. He sold the papacy. That's not a metaphor. He literally accepted money in exchange for stepping down as pope. But before we reach that astonishing transaction, consider the deeper question that had begun to settle across Europe. It is perhaps one of the most surreal moments in the history of the papacy. Imagine it. A pope, not deposed, not assassinated, not even That is the strange legacy of Benedict IX, a man who viewed the church not as a spiritual duty, but as a family inheritance, to be taken, traded, and sold. Let us step carefully into that moment when divine authority had a price tag. We left off in the early 1040s. Benedict IX had already shocked Rome with his rumors of orgies in the Lateran palace and brazen displays of favoritism and greed. Yes, a pope seeking to abandon celibacy for a noble woman whose name is lost to history. By 1044, he'd been expelled once by an outraged public, then returned by force, resumed the papacy and comfort, while still placing the throne of St. Peter into trustworthy hands, and continued to treat the Holy Office like a private estate. He was scandalized by Benedict's conduct and desperate to prevent further corruption, but even Benedict seemed to grow weary of it all. According to chroniclers, he began to express dissatisfaction not with the state of the church, but with the burdens of office. He wanted, allegedly, to get married. An elegant transition. A corruption finally ended. And so, in 1045, a plan was set in motion, one that would ensure the young pope could leave his office with wealth. That trustworthy hand, his godfather, Archpriest John Grayson, was a respected and devout cleric. Known for his piety, Gratian wanted to reform the church. He kept his claim in theory, if not in practice. And because Sylvester III had never formally been removed, his claim still lingered as well. Even good intentions couldn't wash away the stain. So, according to several sources, Gratian agreed to pay Benedict a vast sum of money, possibly to fund his wedding, though some say it was a bribe cloaked in moral intentions. The prestige of the papacy was in tatters. Christendom looked on in embarrassment and confusion, and Benedict accepted. There, at the Council of Sutri, the entire mess was laid bare. The price, while the exact figure is unknown, the money was said to be unusually vast, enough to secure a lifetime of comfort for the former pope. In exchange, Benedict resigned his position, the first pope in history to do so voluntarily, and Gratian ascended to the throne under the name Pope Gregory VI. It was supposed to be a clean break, but of course, it wasn't. Shortly after Benedict's resignation, the whole thing unraveled. You see, Benedict never formally renounced the papacy. For the first time in history, there were three rival popes, each with their own loyalists, each with their own claims. It was the beginning of the imperial reform movement that would lead to massive changes in how the church governed itself in the coming century. His final reign lasted only a few months before he was expelled yet again, this time for good. Or was he the embodiment of everything wrong with the 11th century church, decadent, corrupt, and morally bankrupt? The records are vague. His final years, like much of his life, were mired in contradiction. And while Gregory VI was by all accounts a moral man, his purchase of the papacy was viewed as some a heretical crime. Chaos reigned. It was at this point that the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry III, intervened, determined to restore order to the church and to imperial authority over it. He marched to Rome in 1046. The result, Sylvester III was declared an illegitimate claimant, and Gregory VI, despite his holiness, was forced to abdicate due to the sin of simony. And Benedict IX, now living in retirement and rumored to be full of regret, was declared invalid as well. For a brief moment, the papal throne was completely empty. And so Henry III appointed a new pope of his own, choosing Clement II, a German bishop with no ties to Roman nobility. But of course, the story of Benedict IX wasn't quite over yet. In 1047, just months after Clement II's death, Benedict returned to Rome and reclaimed the papacy by force for a third time. He would fade from public life after 1048 and die sometime later, perhaps quietly forgiven. So what are we to make of this boy pope, this three-time pontiff, this seller of the sacred? Was Benedict IX simply a product of his environment, a noble child thrust into a world of power before he could comprehend it? The name Benedict IX should have faded quietly into the dusty scrolls of forgotten church history, a name among hundreds, little more than a footnote in a long list of pontiffs. And yet, centuries later, his story is still told not because of miracles, sermons, or theology, but because he sold the papacy, ruled 3 separate times, and may have died excommunicated by the very church he once led. His is a legacy not of light, but of shadow, a reminder of how deep the cracks in a divine institution can run when power overshadows purpose. After his final expulsion in 1048, Benedict IX vanished from public life. No papal bulls, no decrees, no formal writings. It's as though the church, and perhaps Benedict himself, sought to erase the memory of what had occurred. Some accounts suggest he sought forgiveness, that he confessed his sins to church authorities in private, that he may have entered a monastery in penance. Others claim he continued to cause scandal, living out his days in bitterness, cast aside by a church he once controlled. His final years are shrouded in silence. But the truth is this: we do not know. What we do know is that his reign triggered something significant. Let's zoom out. By the time Benedict IX disappeared from the scene, the papacy had become a theatrical farce. In the eyes of much of Europe, the message was simple but urgent. The church must be free from lay interference and internal corruption. Popes had been bought and sold. Rivals had fought in the streets. Noble families like the Counts of Tusculum, Crescenti, and others had installed uncles, sons, and nephews like chess pieces. And so, under the pressure of scandal, a movement was born. In the years after his papacies, canon lawyers began debating questions that had never been asked so urgently before. In the decades that followed, especially under popes like Leo IX, Gregory VII, and Urban II, a wave of reform began to sweep through the church. This period, known as the Gregorian Reform, pushed for the end of simony, the enforcement of clerical celibacy, and the freedom of papal elections from aristocratic control. And though these reforms would take decades and would lead to massive conflicts like the investiture controversy, they were shaped in part in direct reaction to the abuses of men like Benedict IX. He was raised in a household that viewed the papacy not as a sacred duty, but as a tool of family power. He was placed into a position he was not spiritually or emotionally prepared to handle, and blamed for failing to uphold its dignity. Even in theological terms, Benedict's legacy loomed large. Can a pope resign voluntarily? But behind the scandal is the portrait of a young man born into a corrupt system and shaped by it, only to be swallowed by it in the end. He remains the only pope to reign 3 separate times, the only one to sell the office, and arguably the most scandalous of them all. More interested in indulgence than in incense. Is a papal act valid if the pope himself is morally corrupt? Can someone be elected pope more than once? These legal questions, though dry on the surface, would have enormous implications for the 1,000 years of Catholic history. Ironically, in selling the papacy, Benedict IX helped redefine it. There's also something quietly tragic about Benedict's story. He was likely no more than a child when he inherited the throne of St. Peter. His failures were real. His behavior, by all accounts, is shocking. The Catholic Church would go on. It would face greater challenges, still schisms, reformations, inquisitions, but in time, the office of Pope would recover its spiritual prestige. And yet, the shadow of Benedict IX lingers. So when we think of the Church today with its ornate centuries of tradition and claims of apostolic continuity, it's worth remembering that there was a time when it nearly unraveled at the hands of a teenage noble. And perhaps more curiously still, if the throne of St. Peter could be sold once, what stopped it from being sold again? Good evening once again. Let your thoughts settle as the flicker of candlelight slows your breath, and your senses slip gently into the soft hush of another tale long buried by time. Tonight, we descend into what historians would later call the Saeculum, a time not of spiritual light, but of political shadow, when popes rose not by divine calling, but through backroom deals, family vendettas, and, at times, sheer brute force. At the heart of this murky chapter stood Pope Sergius III, a man who clawed his way to the papacy, but twice, amid chaos, scandal, and bloodshed. His reign marked a turning point, where the line between pope and warlord blurred, and where the throne of St. Peter became little more than a seat of temporal power, passed down through generations of Roman aristocrats. Let us return now to the late 9th and early 10th centuries, to a Rome torn between rival factions, imperial ambitions, and a church struggling to remember its purpose. From a young age, Sergius was marked out for the clergy not for his piety, but for his political usefulness. Sergius was born around the year 860 CE into the powerful house of a noble Roman family with deep ties to both military and ecclesiastical power. The papal elections of this era were not spiritual ceremonies. They were violent contests, where armed militias, bribery, and assassination determined who would wear the white robes. Sergius was excommunicated, his claim nullified. He fled Rome and spent the next 7 years in exile, nursing ambitions and waiting for his moment to return. When Stephen VI declared Formosus's ordinations, Sergius's own clerical position was technically void, yet he remained in favor with the new regime. By the time he rose to the rank of Bishop of Carrara, the papacy itself had become a prize fought over by Rome's most powerful families. He drove out Pope Christopher, who had ruled briefly but lacked the power to defend his position. Some sources claim Christopher was imprisoned. Others say he was strangled in a dungeon, though it's unclear if Sergius ordered the execution directly. The imperial presence had all but vanished, leaving a vacuum that the great Roman families were eager to fill. Among them, the Theophylacti, a dynasty of military and clerical power brokers, had begun to dominate the city. Sergius's first bid for the papacy came in the year during the same chaotic period that saw Pope Stephen VI hold the infamous cadaver sin at the trial of the corpse of Pope Formosus, but for what it symbolized: the beginning of the Church's darkest political entanglements. According to later chroniclers, Sergius III fathered a child who would one day inherit the papal throne. He annulled the decisions of John IX and reinstated the verdicts of the cadaver synod, once again declaring Formosus's ordinations invalid, often referred to as the pornocracy or rule of the harlots. When the papacy was openly controlled by a series of powerful Roman women, especially Theodora and her daughter Maria, it was a political statement, aligning the papacy once more with the Sergius was part of the anti-Formosus faction. He had been ordained a bishop by Formosus himself, but later aligned with the nobles who viewed Formosus's papacy as illegitimate. He restored order to the streets of Rome, albeit through harsh methods. His reign saw military consolidation, the suppression of rival factions, and the rebuilding of churches destroyed in earlier riots. The office of St. Peter, once seen as a spiritual lighthouse, had become a hereditary post, passed between the children of mistresses and the heirs of warlords. In the wake of Stephen VI's assassination, a rapid string of short-lived popes followed, each one fallen victim to the ever-shifting alliances of Roman noble families. Then, in 898, Sergius made his move. He was elected pope by one faction of Roman aristocrats and claimed the title as Pope Sergius III. She was also, according to many sources, Sergius's mistress. The relationship would become infamous, not only for its scandal, but because it produced a son, John, who would later become Pope John XI. But almost immediately, he was forced out. His rival, Pope John IX, had the support of another noble clan and the backing of the Holy Roman Emperor, and that moment came in 904. By this point, Rome had descended into total lawlessness. Sergius, with their support, returned to Rome with an army. In either case, by the end of 904, Sergius III had seized the papacy by force. He would now rule Rome for the next 7 years, and his reign would become infamous, not just for its brutality. One of Sergius's first acts was to reverse the decisions of his predecessors. But what truly defined Sergius's reign wasn't his theological decisions. It was his personal alliances, especially with one woman, Theodora. Theodora was the wife of Theophylact, the first, the most powerful man in Rome. That's right. This wasn't just a scandal, it was the foundation of a new era under Sergius III. This dark partnership began, but for all his sins, Sergius ruled with efficiency and power. He also began to reassert papal control over parts of central Italy, reminding nobles that, while the church might be corrupt, it was not yet powerless. Yet beneath the surface, something more troubling was growing. For the first time in centuries, the moral authority of the Pope had all but evaporated. What remained to be seen was how deep the church would allow itself to sink before someone would call it back to the light. The papal throne had long been an object of ambition, but by the early 900s, under the rule of Pope Sergius III, it had become something else entirely. An inheritance, a reward passed among the noble families of Rome, as if Christendom itself were no more than a family estate. But what made Sergius's reign especially unique, especially dark, was not just his violence, or his theological reversals, or his ruthless consolidation of power. It was that his papacy marked the beginning of an era dominated not by men, but by a line of Roman women whose influence behind the scenes of the Vatican would shake the foundations of the Catholic Church for nearly a century. This era, often called the pornocracy, or the rule of the harlots, began with Theodora, wife of Theophylact I, and continued through her daughter. Let us now enter that world one of silk, whispers, poison, and legacy. The city's noble families had finally been brought under relative order, and the papal court hummed with both fear and decadence. But while his public face remained stern and forceful, the real power in Rome sat in private quarters, specifically those of Theodora. By 906 CE, Sergius III had solidified his control over Rome. Rome itself became an enclave of control, a place where loyalty was rewarded and dissent invited exile. Or worse, she was clever, politically shrewd, and unafraid to act. They were strategists, using their proximity to power to arrange marriages, build alliances, and slowly, methodically prepare the next generation of papal rule. Most chroniclers agree that she was Sergius's mistress, though some argue it may have been her daughter, Marozia, who truly held his attention. If true, this would make John the first known illegitimate son of a pope to later hold the papal throne himself. His reversal of the cadaver synod ensured that Pope Formosus's legacy remained stained, but more than that, it sent a message. Sergius was in control, and those who opposed him, alive or dead, would be publicly disgraced. Either way, the Sergius-Theodora-Marozia triangle became the nucleus of power in Rome. For decades to come, he strengthened ties with sympathetic nobles in southern Italy and sent envoys to monasteries across Europe to enforce papal edicts. To them, Sergius was a stain on the office of man, more concerned with carnal alliances than with clerical discipline. Theodora was no ordinary noblewoman, and through this trio, the church became almost indistinguishable from the court politics of a medieval kingdom. Sergius's reign saw him continue to undermine the legitimacy of his enemies. The Pope was gone. To reinforce this message, Sergius used his office to appoint loyal bishops, replace dissenting clergy, and punish cities that refused his authority. The church under Sergius became increasingly secular. The Vatican was no longer a spiritual lighthouse. It was now a noble fortress, wrapped in velvet and guarded by swords. Marozia, in particular, would go on to control multiple popes, even installing her own teenage son, John XI, as pontiff years later. She would eventually take the title Senatrix of Rome, ruling the Eternal City outright. Meanwhile, Theodora and her daughter Marozia were not merely, according to chroniclers like Lukebrand of Cremona, a bitter critic of the era. Sergius fathered a child with Marozia's son named John, who would go on to become Pope John XI. Imagine the implications. The son of a pope, born through scandal, groomed to inherit the seat of St. Peter. It was a clear sign that the papacy had not merely been corrupted, it had become a dynasty, dominated not by the Holy Spirit, but by Roman bloodlines. Yet even as power shifted behind silk curtains and noble bedchambers, Sergius III ruled Rome with undeniable efficiency. He ordered the restoration of many churches, sponsored architectural rebuilding projects, and re-established papal authority over the. His rule was deeply unpopular among moral reformers. especially those in distant regions who had little interest in the political games of Rome. And yet, no one could unseat him. He ruled until his death in 911, dying peacefully, an office a rarity for popes of the age. The shadow he left behind was vast. After Segus's death, his allies, the Theophylact family, and their matriarchs continued to dominate the church. But more on her later. For now, in the years immediately following Sergius's death, Rome stood at a strange crossroads. By the time Pope Sergius III died in the year 911, the seeds he had planted had taken deep, choking root in the Church of Rome. His papacy was over, but the era he shaped, the Saeculum Obscurum, or Dark Age of the papacy, had only just begun. The papacy would be passed, not through spiritual succession, but through marriage, kinship, and inheritance, all orchestrated by the very women who had moved quietly behind the scenes during Segus's reign. What followed was not a single tragedy or a lone scandal, but a generation of rule by bloodline, greed, and political seduction. The church had become a family affair, and the matriarch, at the center of it all, was But Anastasius, like several of his immediate successors, was little more than the real authority belonged to the Roman nobility, especially Theophylact I, and more significantly, his daughter Marozia. She was never pope in name, but for many years, she was Rome's true sovereign. After Sergius's death, the power vacuum was filled swiftly by Anastasius III, a figure likely installed by the Theophylacti, the Theophylact family, and their offspring, including husbands, sons, and cousins, used the papacy as a stepping stone to consolidate Roman power, turning the Holy See into the epicenter of their dynasty. Some were poisoned, others forced into monasteries, others still simply vanished from the record. Bishops in Gaul and Germania began issuing independent decrees, no longer waiting for guidance from Rome. The papacy, for a time, ceased to be the spiritual center of the Christian world. Marozia had inherited not only her mother Theodora's beauty and charm, but also her political cunning. During a power struggle at her wedding to King Hugh of Italy, Alberic led a coup, imprisoned his own mother in Castel Sant'Angelo, and exiled her from political life. He would become pope, and not while still a teenager, just 21 years after Sergius III's death, completing the cycle of nepotism and turning the papal office into a hereditary title. Her descendants would continue to play a central role in the papacy for decades. It wasn't until the middle of the 11th century, nearly 100 years after Sergius III's reign, that the Gregorian reforms would begin to peel away the layers of political corruption that had wrapped around the church like ivy. His spiritual record was barren. As Sergius's likely lover and the mother of his child, she was perfectly positioned to manipulate the church's highest offices, but of an opacity of purpose on age when the church lost sight of what it was meant to be, where women behind the scenes wielded enormous influence, not by virtue of office, but through familial strategy, where the voice of the church became, for a time, little more than a whisper behind palace walls. And sometimes, it is not through force or heresy, but through inheritance, affection, and silence. In the decades that followed, she orchestrated the appointment of her son, John XI, to the papacy. And though Pope John XI wore the robes, it was Marozia who ruled, but as a Roman prince, a patron, a lover, and a political manipulator. From her residence at Castel Sant'Angelo, a towering fortress on the banks of the Tiber, she held court, issued commands, and bent the church to her will. This period saw the papacy become something almost feudal. Popes ruled briefly, then disappeared. Between 904 and 964, a staggering 10 different popes reigned in less than 60 years, many serving only months or days. The spiritual authority of the church crumbled. Monasteries distanced themselves. It had become a pawn of Roman nobility, a prize passed between lovers and sons like a gilded heirloom. But power never goes unchallenged forever. In 932, Marozia's own son Alberic II, born of a different father, turned against her. John XI, her son and the sitting pope, was reduced to a puppet under his half-brother's control. Even in the shadows, Marozia's influence lingered. And what of Sergius's legacy? In one sense, He left no theological writings, no doctrinal contributions, no saintly relics, but in another, more unsettling sense, he redefined the role of the Pope not as a shepherd of souls. He ushered in an age where papal legitimacy was no longer rooted in divine calling, but in military backing and noble blood. Today, when historians refer to the saeculum obscurum, they speak not only of the darkness of moral decline, and at the center of it all stood Sergius III, the man who returned from exile, seized the throne, reversed history's course, and passed the crown to his lover's son. So when we look back across the centuries, past the saints and scholars, past the councils and cathedrals, there remains this strange truth. Even the holiest of thrones can be pulled into the mud. Good evening. Again, let your eyes grow heavier, your breath slow, as we return to the marble halls of power and the dusty chapels of medieval Rome. A time when Rome's holiest office was entrusted to a boy barely past puberty, one who treated it not as a sacred calling, but as a personal playground. His name was Octavianus, and he would become Pope John the... But tonight, we move from the shadows of secret lovers and whispered deals to a time when the papacy itself became a spectacle of vice. The imperial crowns of Europe were shifting once more, and the relationship between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor had never been more strained. The Church was still under the influence of powerful Roman families, particularly the Crescenti and Tusculani, whose control over the papacy had made it, effectively, a hereditary institution. Our tale begins with a teenager. We are now in the middle of the 10th century Rome, 955 CE. Octavian was the son of Alberic, a prince of Rome and de facto ruler of the city. Alberic, though never Pope himself, wielded supreme power over who sat on St. Peter's throne, and as his death approached, he made one final political move. On his deathbed, Alberic forced the Roman nobility to swear an oath that his son Octavian, then just about 17 years old, would be made Pope. And when Alberic died shortly thereafter, they honored that vow. In December 955, Octavian was elected Pope John XII. Now pause and think about that for a moment. A teenage boy inheriting the papal throne, with no experience, no theological training, and total control of one of the most powerful religious institutions in the Western world. What could go wrong? Liutprand and other sources were writing with moral outrage, and their accounts were colored by their desire for reform. Exaggeration was common. As it turned out, nearly everything. From the moment John XII ascended to the papacy, his reign took on the tone not of spiritual leadership, but of lavish, unchecked indulgence. He was also a political actor, soon found himself entangled in imperial ambitions. Contemporary sources, many of them biased reformers, its true paint, a portrait of near-total corruption. Otto had been consolidating power across the Germanic kingdoms and had his sights set on reviving the title of Holy Roman Emperor. He was accused of turning the Lateran Palace into a brothel, inviting mistresses and even prostitutes into the papal residence. If he crowned Otto, he might gain a powerful ally. He was said to have toasted the devil during drinking games. Some claimed he gambled with church funds, that he blessed swords used in duels, and that he held orgies within sight of the altar. One particularly damning chronicler, Liutprand of Cremona, claimed that John violated virgins and widows and committed incest with his own niece. Now, not every claim should be taken at face value. Still, even with generous skepticism, a consistent theme emerges. John XII showed little regard for the sacred duties of his office. The Pope wanted Otto's soldiers, not Otto's sermons. He was, in essence, a noble playboy with a crown and a crucifix. John fled the city, abandoning his holy seat and leaving the Lateran empty. But John wasn't just a libertine. There, in November 963, the assembled bishops issued a formal list of charges against the absent pope. Among the accusations, in 962, needing military aid against rival Italian nobles, John invited Otto, the first king of Germany, to Rome. John saw an opportunity, and so, on February 2nd, 962, in a lavish ceremony, Pope John XII crowned Otto I as Holy Roman Emperor, reviving a tradition that had lain dormant since the death of Charlemagne's heirs. At first, all seemed well, but trouble was brewing. John quickly realized that Otto intended to exert imperial influence over the papacy. Something John, young and headstrong, he began secretly negotiating with Otto's enemies, including Berengar. When Otto learned of the betrayal, he returned to Rome in fury. Otto, furious and humiliated, called a synod in St. Peter's Basilica. Others said he was murdered by a jealous husband, catching him in bed with his wife. One rumor said he simply fell ill and collapsed in the Lateran Palace. Murder we will never know. The records are vague. The scandalous possibilities are many. Perjury, simony, adultery, and incest, desecration of holy relics. And perhaps most famously, that John had invoked pagan gods and offered wine to Satan and Tosa, charge that sounds dramatic, but was taken seriously at the time. The bishops voted to depose Pope John XII, and Otto appointed a new Pope, Leo VIII, in his place. And just like that, John XII became the only pope in history to be deposed for criminal behavior by an emperor. But it didn't end there, because as soon as Otto left Rome, John returned with loyal Roman militia at his back and violently reclaimed the papacy. Leo VIII was chased out. John convened his own synod, declared Otto's actions illegal, and excommunicated everyone who had opposed him. Rome, once again, became a city under siege, caught between emperor and pope, faith and faction, church and clan. And here, in the middle of all this violence and decadence, a strange quiet began to creep into the story. Because just a few months after returning to power, in May 964, John XII died suddenly. The cause? Some claimed he was struck by divine lightning while in the act of adultery. The truth, but the outcome was the same. John XII died in his early 20s, leaving behind a church shaken, discredited, and drifting. And so we are left with a question that echoes through the cracked marble of ruined basilicas and the brittle parchment of forgotten chronicles. The Lateran Palace stood silent as the body of Pope John XII was laid out for burial. Whether he died from divine retribution or a jealous husband's dagger, no one could say for sure. His short life had cast long shadows, and for many reformers across Europe, his reign was proof that the Church had lost its way. Instead, it triggered yet another chain of conflict between Rome and the Holy Roman Empire, between papal loyalists and imperial reformers. The scandal of his life continued to ripple outward long after he was gone. But Rome, always watching, whispered its theories in candlelit corners and behind the flickering tapestries of noble villas. They elected Benedict V, a Roman deacon with a reputation for scholarship and humility. To the Roman clergy, it seemed a necessary reset, a way to restore dignity and calm after the chaos of John's papacy. His forces laid siege to the city. The walls were breached, resistance collapsed, and Otto entered in triumph. Benedict V was arrested, and a council convened at Gannat, St. Peter's Basilica. At just around 24 years old, John XII had managed to corrupt, disrupt, and nearly destroyed the reputation of the papacy itself. Though favored by Otto and loyal to the reforming vision of imperial rule, many in Rome saw him as an outsider, a puppet of German power. But beneath the politics, a deeper rot remained, a spiritual crisis sparked in large part by the excesses of John XII. His background was lay, his election irregular, and so, despite his position, his papacy never fully stabilized the church. How could it claim to be the moral compass of Christendom when its most visible leaders were gamblers, seducers, and traitors? But the fact that he had been born into a church that had already accepted corruption as normal, but his death, as sudden as it was, did not bring clarity or healing. After John's abrupt death in May 9, the Roman nobility acted quickly to assert their authority. Before Otto could return to the city, his grandfather had been Pope Sergius III, possibly through incest. And from the moment John was born, he had been groomed to take the papal throne, not through divine calling, but through family obligation. From Otto's perspective, Benedict's election was an insult. a defiance of imperial authority and the legitimacy of the synod that had removed John in the first place, and where the line between sacred duty and private indulgence had been thoroughly erased. But Emperor Otto, I saw things differently. The entire 10th century was filled with popes of questionable virtue and noble lineage, all caught in the web of Roman aristocracy and imperial pressure, a vivid, brooding reminder of what could happen when spiritual authority was left to the whims of secular power. In his mind, the true Pope Leo VIII, whom he had installed during John XII's exile, was still alive and rightful. He may have betrayed emperors, desecrated relics, and brought shame to the throne of St. Peter. In that sense, he exposed a truth others had politely ignored. According to chroniclers, his pallium, the white woolen garment worn by popes, was torn from his shoulders in a humiliating ceremony. Yet Otto, in a rare gesture of restraint, allowed Benedict to remain a bishop, to ask hard questions, to eventually begin the long, slow process of reform that would reshape the Catholic world for centuries to come, and exiled him to Hamburg, far from Rome, where he lived out his days in quiet obscurity. And so, within weeks, Otto marched back into Rome, and Peter Damia, who would come to prominence in the next century. This time, the emperor didn't come with ceremony. There, Benedict was publicly stripped of the papal insignia. With Benedict deposed, Leo VIII was restored to the papacy as authority, secured by imperial force. But Leo VIII, too, was a controversial figure. The years that followed were marked by yet more tension between emperor and pope, a cycle that would continue for generations. The church's moral legitimacy had been severely damaged. What made John XII especially scandalous wasn't just his youth or his vice. His father, Alberic II, had ruled Rome like a prince. His behavior, shocking though it was in many ways a natural product of his world. A world where the papacy had become a hereditary monarchy across Europe. Word of John's behavior traveled fast. Monasteries in Germany and France wrote damning chronicles. Bishops questioned whether Roman authority should even be recognized. The seeds of what would later become the Gregorian reforms were quietly sown in the minds of men like Bruno of Cologne to these future reformers. The legacy of John XII was not just a footnote in church history, it was a warning. And yet, John XII was not unique. His reign was simply more extreme, more lurid, more unrepentant than those around him. John simply tore the mask off. He didn't hide he didn't cloak his political schemes and diplomacy. He didn't care for decorum. And so we're left with a strange conclusion. John XII may have turned the Vatican into a brothel, but in doing so, he also forced the church to confront itself. History doesn't always move forward in a straight line. Sometimes it crashes and stumbles, slipping into vice and darkness before it begins to climb again. And in that darkest hour of the papacy, John XII was both a symbol of the fall and a shadow from which renewal would someday rise. By the end of 964 CE, Pope John XII was dead, and the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I had reasserted imperial control over the papacy. But the damage had already been done. The Lateran Palace had seen more debauchery than doctrine, and the sacred halls of St. Peter's echoed less with prayers than with the angry rumblings of political manipulation. The boy pope's brief but scandalous rule had left the church fractured, humiliated, and exposed. Otto hoped his influence would restore moral clarity and political order, but the legacy of John XII had made the church's problems impossible to ignore. What followed was not peace, but confusion. After Otto restored Leo VIII to the papacy, the empire and the church entered an uneasy alliance. The cardinals jockeyed for influence. Bishops questioned Rome's legitimacy. The Roman nobility continued to treat the papacy as an inheritance, while the emperor treated it as a tool of imperial policy. Even though John was gone, the behavior he normalized lingered like incense in the Vatican corridors. And across Europe, observers began to ask, was the papacy still the voice of Christ? Or had it become just another court of power? These were places where monks still took vows seriously, where silence was sacred, and where the rule of Saint Benedict was observed with devotion. Instead, They began to write, to teach, and to build a vision for a purer church, one free from the grip of noble families and youthful tyrants. The crisis of faith, born in John's scandals, would take generations to mend. But not everyone had abandoned hope. In quiet corners of Europe, especially in the reformed monasteries of Cluny, Gors, and Monte Cassino, new movement was stirring. They looked to Rome with sorrow, but they didn't turn away. This movement, over the coming decades, would give birth to the Gregorian reforms, aiming to end simony. To them, the papacy's internal politics were a distant rumble, something discussed in taverns and marketplaces, but rarely understood in full. The emperor had marched in and out. Popes were crowned and deposed like kings in a chess match. The Lateran, once a symbol of holy stability, now stood for instability and scandal. Enforce clerical celibacy, free the church from secular interference, and elevate the moral expectations of popes. In a strange irony, it was the scandal of John XII that gave this movement its most powerful justification. And what of the people of Rome? He shattered any illusion that the Pope was automatically holy by virtue of his office, and he forced the church to begin asking difficult questions about power, morality, and the purpose of leadership. For the citizens of the eternal city, life went on. Most were not theologians. They were craftsmen, merchants, farmers, and servants. What they did understand was that Rome had become a city of uncertainty, and yet the church endured. It always did. In the broader context of history, John XII's papacy was short less than a decade, but its consequences were vast. He set new lows in papal conduct that shocked even his contemporaries. In this sense, John XII became a tragic paradox, the most disgraceful pope of his era, and one of the most historically necessary. His failures became catalysts, his disgrace a mirror, and in the centuries that followed, as the church slowly rose from its moral ashes, his name would be whispered less as a warning and more as a turning point. The Vatican, for all its gold and glory, has always walked a narrow line between the divine and the political, the spiritual and the human. And sometimes, as with John XII, it has fallen. But in falling, the church remembered what it was meant to be, and maybe that, in the long, wandering tale of history, is what saves it again and again. Good evening once more, dear listener. Let your thoughts drift away from the present, from the gentle hum of modern life. As we settle deeper into history tonight, we journey to the Renaissance, not to admire its frescoes or inventions, but to study one of its darkest paradoxes. A pope famed not for his piety, but for his family's ambition, intrigue, and ruthless consolidation of power. Tonight, we meet Rodrigo Borgia, better known to history as Pope Alexander VI, perhaps the most infamous of all Renaissance popes, and certainly one of the most controversial men to ever wear the tiara. He was clever, charismatic, endlessly ambitious, and unrepentantly corrupt. But a dynastic battlefield where loyalty was bought, alliances were sealed with blood, and the name Borgia became both feared and reviled. And under his reign, the Vatican became not just the spiritual heart of Christendom, but far from the Atlantic, in the palaces of Rome. Another conquest was underway, one that would shape the heart of Europe. Let's begin in the year 1492. That date, of course, rings familiar. It's the year Christopher Columbus set sail from Spain to the New World. He was not a young man, 61 years old at the time, but he was seasoned, wealthy, and strategic. His time had come. Rodrigo Borgia, already a cardinal for decades, was preparing for the papal conclave. The Dominican preacher Girolamo Savonarola, watching from Florence, proclaimed it as a sign of God's wrath. Others, like foreign ambassadors, described it more diplomatically, as a man eminently suited to rule in all worldly matters. He became cardinal deacon at just 25, and over the next 4 decades, he built a vast network of supporters through bribery, charm, favors, and marriages. Born in Valencia, Spain, Rodrigo was nephew to Pope Calixtus III, and was brought to Rome as a young man to climb the church ranks. By the time of the conclave, he was one of the most powerful figures in the Curia, and everyone knew what he was about to do. The 1492 papal conclave was more auction than election. Entire dioceses were promised. Gold changed hands. Influence flowed freely. The process shocked even those accustomed to corruption and alliances, as if the Vatican were a royal court rather than the seat of Christendom. He sent Cesare to war. He made the papacy serve, not Christ, but the Borgia name. Rodrigo offered benefices, offices, and castles to key cardinals in exchange for their votes. But it worked. Princes in France and the Holy Roman Empire whispered of a Spanish pope ruling Italy as if it were Aragon. Rodrigo Borgia was elected pope on August 11, 1492, taking the name Alexander VI, and music and the bodies found floating in the Tiber victims. Some believed of Borgia plots. He expanded the role of the Pope as a temporal monarch, not just a spiritual leader. His election was met with quiet horror by reformers. He saw the church as a throne, not a pulpit. He believed it should act like a kingdom and that he, as Pope, was not a humble shepherd, but a prince. That was the key. Alexander VI was not interested in spiritual renewal. He was here to build an empire for his family. Whether the story is true or exaggerated, the reputation stuck, and build it he did. Rodrigo had many children despite his vows of celibacy, but he never denied them. In fact, he celebrated them. Most notably, his son, Cesare Borgia, whom he made a cardinal at age 18 and later a military commander. He entertained overtures from the Ottomans. While negotiating with the emperor, he was a master of diplomacy, even as his soul was. Some believed, forfeit, his daughter Lucrezia Borgia, whose name became associated fairly or not with poison, scandal, and political marriages. His other sons, Juan, and whom he placed in noble houses across Italy and Spain. Rather than hide his offspring, Alexander VI promoted them using papal power to secure lands, titles. He gave Lucretia in marriage to powerful noblemen, then annulled the marriages when they were no longer politically useful. It didn't take long for critics to take notice. Reformers in Germany were outraged. Even in Rome, citizens spoke of the orgies in the Vatican gardens, the banquets dripping with wine. But Alexander did not care. He strengthened papal finances, imposed order on lawless regions, and rebuilt churches. He maintained diplomatic correspondence with kings and emperors. He was efficient, ruthless, visionary, and utterly unrepentant. His reign was marked by violence, but also vision. With Cesare at his side, he began to carve out a papal state through war, marriage, and assassination. All the while, Alexander continued his own affairs, fathering children and lavishing gifts upon his favorites. One banquet held in the Vatican is said to have featured 50 courtesans, dancing and competing for prizes before cardinals and nobles. Still, Alexander's greatest weapon was not violence or wealth, but his ability to outmaneuver every rival. He played France against Spain. He courted the Medici and betrayed them. But even the most cunning prince cannot outrun history. And soon, the enemies of the Borgias would begin to close in. Because when a pope behaves like a king, he begins to make royal enemies. So as the Borgia Empire rose built on love, lies, strategy, and Signora began to murmur, could the throne of St. Peter survive being ruled like a palace of ambition? The death of Pope Alexander VI in August of 1503 brought more than the end of a controversial pontificate. Marked the sudden collapse of the Borgia dynasty, which had once seemed unstoppable. Without the Pope's hand to shield him, Cesare Borgia, the Prince of War, an architect of the family's secular empire, stood vulnerable, surrounded by enemies, weakened by illness, and dependent on alliances that now crumbled like dust. In the corridors of the Vatican, power shifted quickly, and Cesare, once feared by kings, now found himself desperately trying to hold on to the pieces of an empire built, not on faith, but on favors, fear, and force. He could not bribe them. He could not stop what was coming, whether it was poison, malaria, or a botched assassination attempt meant for someone else. We do not know. At the moment of Alexander's death, Cesare was incapacitated, still recovering from the violent fever that had struck both him and his father days earlier. But Cesare lay delirious in bed as the College of Cardinals convened for a new conclave. He could not intimidate them. In the power vacuum, the Cardinals moved with caution and fear. Their first choice, Pius III, a compromise candidate, died just 26 days after his election. His reign was little more than a placeholder. The real blow came with the election of Pope Julius II, a lifelong rival of the Borgia, and a man determined to erase their influence from the map. Towns, once loyal to the Borgias, turned against them. Allies evaporated. His armor was stripped, his body left in a field. Julius moved swiftly, not with a crown, but with a sword in the dirt. In Ferrara, she became a respected duchess, a patron of the arts, and the mother of 7 children. He stripped Cesare of his command, dismantled his authority, and reclaimed the papal states that had been seized through war. He fled Rome and sought refuge with the Spanish crown, hoping to leverage his family ties. Cesare, still sickly but recovering, tried to regroup, but Julius worked behind the scenes to ensure Cesare was arrested, then imprisoned in Spain, where he languished for years. His dreams of kingship reduced to guarded cells and whispered regrets. Eventually, he escaped, made his way to Navarre, and joined the court of King John III. But he was a man at a time. Others are survivors, but few would deny her complexity. In 1507, at the age of 31, Cesare Borgia died in a skirmish, ambushed and struck down while escorting a small force through a mountain pass. So ended the career of the man who inspired Machiavellis, the prince, the man once feared. From Florence to Ferrara, he increased revenues. He navigated the shifting alliances of Renaissance Europe with skill. And what of Lucrezia Borgia? She fared better. Her third marriage, to Alfonso d'Este, proved stable and secure. She distanced herself from the scandals of her youth. Under her guidance, the court of Ferrara became a hub of Renaissance culture, music, and literature. Whether she truly escaped her past or merely lived quietly with her tires, a question history has never fully answered. When does the Palace of God become a battlefield of power? She died in 1519, at the age of 39, after complications from childbirth. Some see her as a victim. As for Alexander VI, his legacy remains perhaps the most contested in papal history. To some, he was the epitome of corruption, a man who openly flouted celibacy, sold offices, and turned the Vatican into a court of lust and luxury. To others, he was a political genius, a product of his time who played the dangerous game of Italian politics better than any pope before him, and better than most princes. He stabilized papal lands, but he also left the church morally bankrupt in the eyes of many. And so, in the decades that followed, reformers began to stir with new urgency. Martin Luther, just 14 years old when Alexander died, would soon rise up to challenge the very institution the Borgias had exploited. The Protestant Reformation, fueled by disgust with papal excess, would tear Christendom apart. And within the church itself, new calls for reform would echo down the marble halls. No longer whispers, but shouts. The Borgias did not cause these revolutions, but they made them necessary. In the end, Pope Alexander VI did more than scandalize Europe. He forced the world to ask, what happens when the shepherd of souls becomes a king of ambition? And perhaps most unsettling, can a church built on faith survive when it has forgotten how to believe in itself? Welcome back as we drift deeper into the long, uncomfortable corridors of church history, where the thrones are cracked, the candles flicker with unrest, and the prayers echo unanswered. Tonight, our journey takes us into the late 14th century, a time of political tremors and spiritual tension. The papacy, already bruised by decades of mismanagement and worldly entanglements, would soon be split in two, not by heresy, not by invasion, but by one man's temperament. That man was Pope Urban VI. He was a reformer, a scholar, a man who seemed at first, to be everything the church needed. And yet he would become the catalyst for one of the most disastrous periods in papal history. The Westons, a 40-year crisis in which two men simultaneously claimed to be the rightful pope. Let's return now to the fateful year, 1378. In fact, for nearly 70 years, the popes had lived in Avignon, a city in southern France. This era, known as the Avignon papacy, had turned the papal court into a French-dominated political organ, lavishly funded and comfortably distant from the chaos of Rome. For much of the 14th century, the papacy had not resided in Rome at all. But this had come at a cost. The papacy had become too French, too decadent, and too detached. The people of Rome, the Italian clergy, and many in the wider church saw the Babylonian captivity, as some called it, as a betrayal. By 1377, under pressure from mystics like St. Catherine of Siena, and from popular unrest in Italy, Pope Gregory XI finally returned the papal court to Rome. But soon after, he died. Rumors of riots, arson, and murder swirled, and the papal conclave that followed would become one of the most fateful and chaotic in history. Of the 16 voting cardinals, the majority were French, and many hoped to return to Avignon. It was April of 1378. The College of Cardinals gathered in the Vatican to elect a new pope. But outside the conclave, Rome was in uproar. He had served under several popes. He was intelligent, fluent in Latin, and not part of any powerful family faction. Reformers saw hope in him, a chance to clean up the Ovian excesses and restore dignity to the papacy. He scolded cardinals for their luxury. He launched abrupt reforms, attacking simony and corruption, but without diplomacy or tact. He accused long-serving clerics of idleness and threatened bishops with punishment. He treated even high-ranking cardinals as subordinates and often as suspects, the Roman people fearing that the cardinals would once again abandon the city demanded. An Italian pope? Crowds gathered. Angry chants filled the air. Armed men roamed the streets, fearing for their safety and desperate to avoid public outrage. The cardinals chose a compromise candidate, an Italian Buduan who had long served in the papal bureaucracy. That man was Bartolomeo Prignano, Archbishop of Bari. On April 8th, he was elected pope, taking the name Urban VI. They felt betrayed having elected Urban under pressure, only now to be ridiculed and dismissed by him. At first, his election was greeted with cautious optimism. Urban VI was known for his administrative experience. There, they issued a public statement. They declared that Urban's election was invalid, having occurred under mob intimidation and threat of violence. But within weeks, everything began to unravel. Urban revealed himself to be harsh, irritable, and unrelenting. He shouted at his advisors. He called meetings at all hours. At first, they tolerated him. But soon, murmurs began. Was the Pope mad? The French cardinals, in particular, were alarmed. He called for crusades not against pagans or heretics but against his papal rival. Tensions reached a breaking point in the summer of 1378. A group of 13 cardinals fled Rome, retreating to another. They claimed that they had only elected him out of firend. Therefore, the conclave was null. Was this a reformer gone too far, or was he simply unfit for the throne? In September, they elected a rival, Pope Robert of Geneva, who took the name Clement VII. He was soon escorted to Avignon, where he established a second papal court. The church was now officially divided. This was no mere argument. It was a schismal rupture that tore through every corner of Christendom. France, Scotland, Aragon, and Castile recognized Clement VII in Avignon. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and most of Italy stood by Urban VI in Rome. For the first time in centuries, faithful Catholics had to choose between popes, each claiming legitimacy, each excommunicating the other. It was a theological and political disaster. And through it all, Urban VI doubled down. Rather than seek reconciliation, he responded with aggression. He filled the College of Cardinals with loyal Italians. He excommunicated those who opposed him. He grew increasingly paranoid, convinced that conspiracies surrounded him. In 1385, He had 5 cardinals arrested and tortured, some were believed to have been killed in prison. Even his allies began to worry. Urban VI died in 1389, still insisting he was the rightful pope. But the schism he helped ignite would continue for nearly 4 more decades, with 2 competing papal courts, each naming their own cardinals, issuing their own decrees, and undermining the Church's authority. Across Europe, it would take 2 more popes, multiple failed councils, and an eventual 3rd claimant in Pisa, before the schism was finally resolved at the Council of Constance in 1417. By then, an entire generation had grown up not knowing who the true pope was. And so, as we look back on the papacy of Urban VI, one truth stands clear. He was elected as a reformer, he ruled as a tyrant, and his inability to lead with wisdom and grace fractured the Church at its core. Which leaves us with a quiet, unsettling question. Urban VI ruled from Rome with iron resolve, but across the Alps, in Avignon, Clement VII had donned his own tiara, summoned his own court of cardinals, and issued his own blessings. There were now 2 popes, both excommunicating one another, both claiming to be the one true successor of St. Peter. And Christendom found itself facing an impossible question. Which pope was the real pope? This was not a mere political headache. As 1378 gave way to the 1380s, Europe was split like never before. France, loyal to the Avignon papacy, recognized Clement VII and saw Urban VI as an Italian usurper. England, ever eager to oppose France, backed Urban VI in Rome. Castile and Aragon, the Holy Roman Empire, though often at odds with the papacy, supported Rome. Even universities began to choose sides. Scholars in Paris wrote long treatises defending Clement, while Italian theologians replied in kind. And for the ordinary faithful, confusion reigned. Was a marriage performed by an Avignon priest valid? Could one receive communion from a Roman-appointed bishop? Which pope held the keys to heaven? No one knew for certain. And at the heart of this division stood Pope Urban VI, once seen as a hopeful reformer, now seen by many as a man drunk on power. In Rome, Urban continued to rule with increasing paranoia and violent mood swings. He appointed cardinals not for their learning or holiness, but for their loyalty. He surrounded himself with men who would not question him, and he imprisoned or executed those who did. He ordered the construction of fortresses and walls, fearful of plots. He excommunicated nobles, bishops, and even kings who leaned toward a new. In 1385, a particularly dark chapter unfolded. Urban accused several cardinals of conspiring against him. He imprisoned 6, under torture. They confessed, though modern historians suspect these confessions were coerced. 5 of them died in custody. Though considered an antipope by Rome, Clement lived like a prince with fine robes, diplomatic embassies, and a full college of cardinals. This act shocked even Urban's supporters. The papacy was supposed to be a beacon of mercy, not a place of dungeons and chains. Meanwhile, in Avignon, Pope Clement VII worked to strengthen his own position. His court was rich and well. He held sway over much of Spain, France, and parts of Scotland. But the division came at a price. Both papal courts began fundraising aggressively to support their legitimacy. Taxes were doubled. Indulgence ceased. A practice of paying for forgiveness were sold more freely. Wealthy donors were offered offices, favors, and church lands. Others suggested both popes resign to make way for a new, universally recognized successor. The faithful were increasingly burdened, not just spiritually, but financially. Each accused the other of being a tool of the devil. To support the papacies, the church bled its flock. In the midst of this, calls for reform grew louder. One voice came from the University of Paris, where theologians proposed a general council to solve the crisis. But neither Urban VI nor Clement VII would hear of it. His health declined. His decisions became increasingly erratic. He renewed ties with Italian city-states and attempted, with limited success, to extend his influence into Germany. Each believed his claim was divine. Each feared death or disgrace if he stepped down. The standoff hardened, and so the schism became permanent. infecting every bishopric, monastery, and cathedral with uncertainty. And yet, Urban continued as if unmoved. He spent vast sums on building projects in Rome, perhaps to demonstrate the church's strength or perhaps simply to leave a legacy carved in stone. But his internal court was tense, and all the while, Clement's presence in Auvergne remained strong. The two-headed papacy was now the new normal. Urban VI died in October 1389, after 11 bitter years, as Pope. No great public mourning followed. Even his closest allies had grown wary of his temper, his purges, and his unrelenting pride. Yet the schism did not die with him. Instead, the cardinals loyal to Rome quickly elected a new pope, Boniface, and the Avignon court, still loyal to Clement VII, would elect Benedict XIII after Clement's death. Thus began the next generation of dueling popes and the continuation of a crisis that would last for another 3 decades. What began as a frightened conclave's attempt to please the Roman mob had become a theological and political catastrophe. Urban VI had aimed to purify the church, but his tyranny, mistrust, and rigidity deepened the wound instead. And perhaps the most haunting part of it all, for a century after his death, even historians couldn't agree if Urban VI had ever truly been pope at all. So we are left to ask, is righteousness still righteous when wielded without compassion? Can reform without humility turn into ruin? By the time of Pope Urban VI's death in 1389, the Catholic Church had already been torn into 2 rival courts for over a decade, one in Rome and one in Avignon. What had started as a botched election under mob pressure and a deeply volatile papal personality had now hardened into a theological and political stalemate. It was a full-blown spiritual crisis, and, for those living through it, the consequences were deeply unsettling. The Western Schism, as it would later be called, was not merely an embarrassment or administrative inconvenience. With Urban gone, perhaps there might have been a chance for reconciliation. Though more politically savvy than Urban, Boniface maintained the hardline Roman position that the Avignon line was illegitimate, and that reconciliation could only happen if the rival pope stepped down. But instead, the church plunged deeper. Upon Urban's death, the Roman cardinals swiftly elected Pope Boniface. Meanwhile, over in Auvergne, Clement VII had died just weeks before Urban, but his court had already moved to elect a successor, Benedict XIII. Each doubled down on legitimacy. Which blessings, which marriages, which each continued to name cardinals, issue decrees, and collect taxes. The next, a papal envoy from Rome, demands your obedience or threatens excommunication. Both sides now had fresh leaders, but neither would budge. The faithful were caught in the middle. Imagine being a bishop in Burgundy or Catalonia. One day, you're answering to the Pope in Auvergne. Which Pope's sacraments were valid? And what about the afterlife? The French monarchy, which had originally backed the Auvergne papacy, began to reconsider. England, Italy, and parts of Germany remained loyal to Rome, but with growing unease. If you followed the wrong pope, would your soul be in danger? These weren't theoretical questions. They were urgent, daily, and terrifying for clergy and laity alike. They declared both the Roman and Avignon popes deposed and elected a third pope, Alexander V. During this period, the papacy as prestige once seen as the rock upon which Christ's church was built began to erode. Theologians began debating what had once been unthinkable. Was the Pope infallible? Could two true popes exist? Did either deserve obedience? Even kings and emperors began to lose patience. The Holy Roman Empire, trying to maintain stability in its fractious territories, could no longer tolerate the rival popes undermining ecclesiastical authority. From universities to monasteries, from royal courts to village chapels, the church's authority was fraying, and yet both papal courts refused to compromise. The schism deepened further in 1409 with the convening of the Council of Pisa, the selling of indulgences to support rival courts, the excommunications hurled like spears between bishops, the wealth amassed in competing palaces. It all left the church open to reform movements that would soon emerge across Europe. This was an attempt by reformist cardinals from both sides to end the schism once and for all. But instead of resolution, this created a third line. Now, there were Gregory XII in Rome, Benedict XIII in Avignon, in the whispered doubts of ordinary believers who no longer knew who spoke for God. And now, Alexander V, the so-called Pisan Pope. 3 popes, 3 courts, 3 papacies. The confusion had reached absurd proportions. It would not be until 1417, nearly 40 years after Urban VI's election, that the schism was finally resolved at the Council of Constance. There, with strong backing from secular rulers, all rival claims were set aside, and a new Pope Martin Villa was elected and recognized universally. But the damage had already been done. For 2 generations, the papacy had been fractured, mocked, and distrusted. Historians still debate whether Urban VI was truly the villain of the schism, or simply a man overwhelmed by his position in a turbulent time. Some argue that his election, though legal, was a mistake of judgment, that his character, his rigidity, and his pride made healing impossible. Others suggest that the real problem was the church itself, already so entangled with worldly politics that any pope, good or bad, would have struggled. Still, Urban's decisions, his torture of cardinals, his refusal to compromise, and his aggressive appointments set the tone for 4 decades of chaos. And so, Urban VI's legacy is not carved in marble or gold. It is written in the pages of confused parish registers, in the strained relationships between kingdoms. He did not build great cathedrals. He did not inspire reform. He left no memorable sermons, but he left behind a church divided, vulnerable, and in desperate need of healing. Which brings us to the final reflection. When faith is fractured and power is prized above unity, how long can an institution survive on rituals alone? Welcome once again, as we drift deeper into the velvet corridors of forgotten scandal. Tonight, we move from the ashes of the Great Schism and into the world of Renaissance, magnificenza, golden age of art, wealth, and classical revival. But behind the frescoes and marble, behind the lutes and Latin epic, there pulsed something else. Decay disguised as beauty. In this world, where the church adorned itself in splendor and spoken poetry, a pope would rise who embodied its wealth and unwittingly helped shatter it. His name was Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici. History remembers him as Pope Leo X, a patron of Michelangelo and Raphael, a lover of books and banquets, and the man whose indulgence campaign would provoke Martin Luther and ignite the Protestant Reformation. Let us begin in the year 1530, when a Medici became pope. Giovanni de' Medici had been born into power. The Medici family were bankers, politicians, and patron state-funded popes, crowned kings, and commissioned. He was the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, ruler of Florence, and one of the most influential patrons of the Italian Renaissance. And they were ambitious. At the age of just 13, Giovanni was made a cardinal not for his theological insight, but because his father secured it as part of the family's political network. For most of his youth, he lived in Rome as a prince of the church, surrounded by classical manuscripts, tutors, and artists. When the conclave of 1513 convened, Giovanni was just 37 years old, charming, deeply connected, and immensely wealthy. His election as pope came quickly. Few doubted his qualifications, at least for administration, for ceremony, for spectacle. On March 11, 1513, he was elected and took the name Leo X. Upon being crowned, he is said to have smiled and declared, "Let us enjoy the papacy. Since God has given it to us." He saw it as an inheritance, a position of glory, meant to be adorned, celebrated, and enjoyed. Plays were staged in the papal palace. Musicians were imported from France and Flanders. Under Leo, Rome became the beating heart of the high Renaissance, a place of classical revival and aesthetic grandeur. It was a revealing statement. He commissioned architecture, expanded the papal court, and poured funds into the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, which had begun under his predecessor, Pope Julius II. Leo X did not see the papacy as a spiritual burden, nor a divine office marked by sacrifice, and he did enjoy it. His court became one of the most lavish in all of Europe. Cardinals held masquerade balls. Artists dined with scholars, gold-leaf-lined, the Vatican chambers. Over time, these evolved into a system where indulgences could be granted in exchange for donations to the church. He welcomed Raphael, Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci into the papal orbit. But this magnificence came at a cost. Leo X inherited a Vatican deeply in debt, and within a few years, he made it worse. His lifestyle was expensive. To pay for all this, Leo turned to an increasingly controversial tool: the sale of indulgences. Now, indulgences were not new. The church had long offered remission of sins in exchange for pious acts, fasting, pilgrimage, confession. But under Leo X, the system was fully commercialized. He authorized aggressive indulgence campaigns across Europe, especially in German territories, to fund both St. Peter's and the debts of the Medici family. The most infamous of these campaigns was led by Johann Tetzel, a Dominican friar known for his theatrical sermons and marketing flair. Tetzel roamed from town to town with a chest, proclaiming a method, a means to an end. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. It was bold, effective, and, to many, deeply offensive. In Wittenberg, a young Augustinian monk named Martin Luther watched in growing horror. To him, the indulgence campaign wasn't just a fundraising scheme, it was a theological scandal, a corruption of the gospel, and a deception of the faithful. In 1517, Luther would write 95 theses challenging the indulgence trade and nail them to the church door in Wittenberg. The echoes of that act would shake Europe for centuries. But Leo X, in 1513, had no idea what was coming. To him, indulgences were simply a tool. The church needed money. The basilica needed marble. The papacy needed pageantry. And so he pressed on, unaware or perhaps unconcerned that a spiritual revolt was brewing, that indulgences were not just a policy, but a symptom, that for many, the church now looked less like the bride of Christ and more like a Florentine banquet house, wearing holy robes. For now, however, Leo X ruled, unchallenged. The Renaissance glittered around him. Rome was alive with color, light, and song. But somewhere in Saxony, a monk was picking up a pen. And so we ask, when beauty covers a hollow core, how long before the facade crumbles and the truth breaks through? Pope Leo X may have loved the arts, but his reign would become better remembered for a parchment nailed to a door than for any painting on a ceiling. By the year 1517, the Vatican's debts were piling higher than its domes, and Leo's most ambitious legacy, project the complete reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica, was devouring fortunes. The most notorious among them was the Dominican friar. To fund it, Leo expanded the use of indulgences across Europe, transforming spiritual forgiveness into a massive ecclesiastical revenue stream. This was not simply a matter of quietly exchanging alms for grace. It became a highly organized campaign, involving regional contracts, quotas, and traveling preachers. Tetzel's job was clear: sell indulgences to as many Christians as possible, assuring them their payments could free their loved ones from purgatory or even preemptively wipe away the sins of the living. With theatrical flair, Tetzel shouted to crowds across Saxony, "Fear not. When you drop a coin in the box, your grandmother's soul leaps into heaven." These sermons may have filled coffers, but they also stirred the conscience of a quiet German monk named Martin Luther. Luther had grown increasingly concerned with the theological direction of the church. As a professor at the University of Wittenberg, he had spent years reading scripture, preaching, and wrestling with the idea of salvation through grace. To him, the indulgence trade was more than corrupt, it was spiritually dangerous. It implied that salvation could be bought, that forgiveness was a financial transaction, and that the Pope had the power to intervene in the afterlife for a price. On October 31st, 1517, he penned a list of 95 propositions, 95 theses. In keeping with academic custom, posted them on the door of All Saints Church, in which he intended it as a call for debate, not revolution. But the printing press had other plans. Within weeks, thousands of copies of Luther's theses were circulating across Germany and into Rome itself. And so began the Reformation. That the church, under leaders like Leo Bet, had become a gilded shell, more interested in architecture than atonement. Leo X's initial reaction was dismissive. He reportedly referred to Luther as a drunken German monk who would feel better after sleeping it off. The papal court, bloated with confidence, believed the issue would pass like a minor heresy, but they underestimated the moment. Luther had struck a chord. His critiques weren't just theological, they were moral, financial, and institutional. He had given voice to a widespread unease. He commissioned Raphael's final works. He imported exotic animals. He built libraries and debated philosophers. The German princes, long wary of sending money to Rome, supported Luther for both ideological and economic reasons. By 1580, Leo's officials summoned Luther to recant. He refused. Still, Leo moved slowly. Rather than confronting the issue directly, he continued to fund art, expand diplomatic ties, and plan festivals. He was a Renaissance prince, in every way sophisticated, tolerant of ideas, and confident in his divine authority. But he failed to understand the depth of the spiritual revolt unfolding around him. In 1520, as Luther's writings became more radical, rejecting papal authority, entire Leo finally responded with a papal bull, exurge. It condemned Luther's teachings, gave him 60 days to recant, and threatened excommunication. Priests were marrying. Towns were abolishing indulgences. The world around him had changed, but he remained a creature of the old order. Luther's reply, and the church he left behind would soon enter its most profound crises in 1,000 years. He burned the bull in public. On January 3rd, 1521, Pope Leo V. The German princes refused to arrest him. The Reformation had taken root. New churches were forming. Monks and nuns were fleeing their orders. The church's authority, long seen as eternal, was now openly challenged in pulpits across northern Europe. He returned to his palace, to music, to sculpture, to feasts with scholars. Leo X died suddenly in December 1521, at the age of 45, possibly of pneumonia, possibly of poison. Though no evidence ever proved foul play, he died still confident in the power of the church, still unaware of how profoundly his papacy had shifted history. At his death, the coffers were nearly empty. The Reformation was gaining steam. In the end, Leo X did not intend to fracture the faith. He loved books, not battles. He wanted harmony, not heresy. But his failure was this: he mistook beauty for holiness, money for loyalty, and indulgence for reform. And in doing so, he lit the fuse of a revolution that he could neither comprehend nor control. So we ask, can a love of art, culture, and ceremony blind a leader to the cries of a broken flock? And when the pageantry becomes louder than the prayers, who speaks for the soul of the church? By the winter of 1521, Pope Leo X was dead, and Martin Luther was alive and in hiding his teachings, spreading like wildfire through a Europe that no longer looked Rome as its unquestioned spiritual center. The Reformation was underway, but back in the Vatican, inside chambers still decorated with Raphael's and echoing with the final notes of Medici-sponsored choirs, Leo's papacy had left behind something far deeper than art or debt. It had left behind a crack in the foundation, one so wide that even the gold leaf couldn't cover it. When Leo had taken office in 1530, he had inherited a church already in decline. The Western Schism had ended just a century earlier. Nepotism and simony were rampant. Many clergy were poorly educated and spiritually disengaged. The faithful, especially in Northern Europe, were growing skeptical of Rome's taxes and bureaucracy. But Leo had not addressed these underlying problems. Instead, he elevated the church as a patron of Renaissance culture, lavishing its resources on the visual, the ceremonial, and the symbolic. And for a time, it worked. St. Peter's grew grander. Rome flourished. But beneath the polished marble, a quiet, rot-festered spiritual disillusionment, moral fatigue, and economic resentment. A serious man of Dutch origin, more monk than Prince Adrian, admitted that Rome itself needed repentance. He acknowledged corruption, waste, and pride. And when Luther spoke out, that rot was suddenly exposed to sunlight. After Leo's death, his successor, Pope Adrian VI, would try to reform the church in earnest. But his efforts came too late. Whole regions had begun rejecting papal authority. Luther had translated the Bible into German. Pamphlets spread doctrine to peasants and nobles alike. Priests and monks were abandoning their vows, declaring salvation by faith alone. A lover of beauty, learning, and splendor. A ruler who supported Raphael and Michelangelo, elevated the arts, and gave Rome back its glory. The Reformation had already become a movement, not a protest. Even monarchs saw an opportunity to seize church lands, break free from tithes, and wield spiritual power for themselves. It wasn't just a sesame, it was a tectonic shift. He presided over a system where indulgences were a currency, where confession had become a toll booth, and where salvation could be packaged like a contract. And what of Leo's legacy? To his admirers, he remains the last great Renaissance pope. To his critics, it was a worldly prince in holy robes, who ignored the cries of reform and laughed off the very storm that would later consume the church. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Leo did not cause the Reformation alone, but he embodied the church's failure to understand the spiritual needs of its people. And so, with his passing, Europe entered a new age. The church would splinter into Catholic, Lutheran, Reformed, Anglican, and many more. Religious wars would erupt. Councils would convene. Blood would be spilled in the name of Christ for generations. But the quiet origin of all that turmoil, a pope who sold pardons to pay for marble. Even in Rome, people began to ask, had God withdrawn his favor? Had the church strayed too far from its purpose? And more haunting still, would it ever return to what it once was? Or had the veil of grandeur forever replaced the voice of humility?